Selim Thorne existed in the margins of Kingston's high-rise offices, a ghost in a cheap suit who could calculate a company's insolvency faster than a supercomputer. Yet he couldn't find a formula to solve the crushing weight of his brother's mounting medical bills. He was an unmarked Omega, his scent suppressed by bitter pills that left a metallic tang in his mouth, allowing him to stay invisible until the night Sila's vein. The man known as the Ice King for his surgical dismantling of rival corporations found him working at 3:00 a.m. in a darkened archive room. The air in the room instantly changed, thick with Silas's scent of cedarwood and cold mountain air, a fragrance that felt like a predator's shadow stretching over Selim's trembling frame. Silas didn't see a person. He saw a tool, his gray eyes tracking the frantic movement of Selim's pen as he balanced accounts that 3 senior auditors had failed to rectify. "Your talent is wasted on filing," Silas had whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to rattle Selim's very bones as he leaned over the desk, his hand coming to rest inches from Selim's unmarked neck. Selim felt the heat of the Alpha's presence, a terrifying magnetism that promised both salvation from his debts and a total erosion of his autonomy. He looked up into Silas's sharp, glass-cut jawline and realized that he was no longer looking at an employer, but at the man who would either buy his future or burn his world to the ground. Silas's gaze didn't soften. It intensified, a silent demand for submission that Selim finally met with a desperate, shaky nod, sealing a contract written in the invisible ink of a destiny he could never have calculated. The transition from the archives to Silas Vane's private penthouse was a descent into a luxury that felt more like a laboratory than a home. Silas didn't want a lover. He wanted a constant, a mathematical anchor for his chaotic life, and he bound Selim with a contract that paid for his brother's surgeries in exchange for absolute presence. Selim became a living ledger, his days spent in Silas's glass-walled study analyzing high-stakes mergers, while the Alpha watched him with a clinical, possessive hunger that never quite touched the surface. The air between them was always charged, a high-voltage wire of unspoken tension that snapped one rainy evening when Selim, exhausted from 16 hours of tracking a hostile takeover, tripped against Silas's broad chest. The Ice King didn't push him away. He gripped Selim's waist with fingers that felt like iron brands, his scent of cedarwood flaring into something wild and predatory. For the first time, Selim saw the crack in Silas's armor, not a softness, but a jagged desperation born from a life where everyone was a transaction and no one was a truth. They crashed together against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a desperate, silent collision of heat and need that felt like a bridge being burned behind them. The next morning, Silas was already dressed in a suit that cost more than Selim's childhood home, his face once again a mask of stone as he looked at the bed and muttered, "This was a lapse in discipline. Do not mistake it for a beginning." Selim nodded, his heart a hollow ache, yet as he watched Silas leave, he noticed the Alpha's hand tremble as he adjusted his tie. A small, microscopic variable that Selim recorded with the precision of a scholar, realizing that the Ice King's heart wasn't frozen. It was just under a pressure that was starting to show its first, lethal fractures. The silence that followed their encounter was not empty. It was a heavy, suffocating pressure that Selim felt in his lungs every time Silas entered a room. But the true shift began when Selim realized the metallic tang in his mouth was no longer from suppressants, but from the sudden, violent rejection of his own body. He hid the morning sickness for 3 weeks, muffling his heaves in the marble bathroom and scrubbing his scent with citrus-heavy soaps, terrified that a child would be seen by Silas as an error in a perfect equation. But Silas, whose life was built on detecting the slightest market fluctuation, noticed the change in Selim's breathing, the way his skin had turned the color of parchment, and the subtle, sweet bloom of an unborn life that even the strongest blockers couldn't fully mask. When the confrontation finally happened, it wasn't a shouting match but a cold, clinical execution. Silas stood in the doorway of the bedroom, his eyes like winter flint as he looked at the positive test Selim had tried to bury in the trash. "A child is a vulnerability I cannot afford," Silas said, his voice stripped of all the heat from that rainy night, replaced instead by the haunted echo of his own father's coldness. Selim fell to his knees, his hands shielding his stomach as he begged for the first time, not for money or his brother, but for the life they had accidentally sparked in the dark. Silas didn't move to comfort him. He called the company clinic with a detached efficiency that made Selim feel like a malfunctioning piece of hardware. As they drove to the facility, Silas kept his hand on Selim's shoulder, a grip that was meant to be steadying but felt like a shackle, ensuring that Selim couldn't run. The procedure was swift and sterile, leaving Selim with a hollow void where a future had briefly flickered. And as he lay in the recovery room, Silas sat in the chair beside him, reading a quarterly report as if the world hadn't just ended. It was then that Selim realized the Ice King didn't just hate weakness. He was terrified of it, and he would burn every bridge of joy to stay on his lonely, frozen island. The recovery was not a return to life, but a descent into a highly regulated stasis where Silas's guilt manifested as a suffocating architectural control. He moved Selim into a remote estate, a masterpiece of steel and glass perched on a cliffside, claiming it was for revalescence, though the guards at the perimeter and the lack of a phone line told a different story. Silas visited every evening bringing gifts that were as expensive as they were soulless. Rare orchids that died in the sea air, silk robes that felt like spiderwebs against Selim's sensitive skin, and books on advanced game theory that Selim couldn't bring himself to open. During their silent dinners, Silas would watch Selim with a hungry, restless intensity, his alpha pheromones filling the dining hall like a storm, demanding a response that Selim's shattered spirit could no longer provide. "You aren't eating," Silas would remark, his jaw tightening as he reached across the table to touch Selim's unmarked neck, his fingers lingering on the skin as if searching for a pulse of the affection that had died in the clinic. Selim would merely nod, a ghost at the table, his mind constantly recalculating the distance to the cliffs and the depth of the water below. One night, Silas brought a specialist to the house, not a doctor for the body, but a behavioral consultant designed to help Selim reintegrate, which Selim knew was code for becoming a compliant consort. When the consultant suggested that Selim needed social interaction, Silas's scent turned into a sharp, ozonic warning, and he dismissed the man within minutes, pinning Selim against the wall of the hallway with a terrifying, desperate possessiveness. "The world outside is chaotic, Selim. Here you are safe. Here you are mine," Silas growled into the hollow of Selim's throat, but his eyes were wide with a flickering, panicked realization that while he held Selim's body captive, the brilliant, mathematical soul he had fallen for was drifting further and further out to sea. The second year of Selim's confinement began with a quiet, calculated defiance. He stopped being a victim and started being a mathematician again, treating the estate's security protocols as a complex cipher to be solved. He became a master of performing the role Silas wanted, eating just enough to stop the Alpha's constant hovering, smiling at the right intervals during their stiff evening walks, and allowing Silas to hold him through the night while his mind worked on the encryption of the estate's primary gate. Silas, desperate for any sign of a return to their early days, mistook this compliance for genuine healing, his cold exterior thawing into a series of clumsy, heartbreaking attempts at affection. He would return from the city with Selim's favorite childhood pastries, or sit on the edge of the bed and read aloud from Selim's old textbooks, his deep voice stumbling over the complex equations as if trying to speak a language he didn't understand. Yet, every time Silas's scent softened into something approaching love, Selim would remember the cold light of the clinic and the way Silas had looked at the quarterly report while Selim bled. The tension broke when Silas discovered Selim had been using the library's offline computer to map the patrol rotations of the guards. The Ice King didn't roar, he simply sat in the leather chair, the glow of the screen illuminating the devastation in his gray eyes. "Is your life with me so unbearable that you would risk the cliffs to leave?" Silas asked, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that Selim had never seen. Selim didn't reach for a notepad. He looked directly at the man who had bought him and then broken him, and for the first time in months he spoke, his voice a raspy, unused shadow of itself. "I am not leaving the house, Silas. I am leaving the cage you built inside my head." The revelation of Selim's mental mutiny sent Silas into a tailspin of frantic, uncoordinated overcompensation, as if he believed he could buy back a soul with the same ease he acquired a subsidiary. He fired the guards and replaced them with high-tech sensors, but he also opened the doors to the garden, pleading with his eyes for Selim to step outside. Yet Selim remained in the center of the library, a statue made of logic and grief. The atmospheric pressure shifted again when Selim realized that fate, or perhaps a flaw in the medical procedure from the year prior, had left a lingering spark of fertility that defied all biological odds. When the second pregnancy was confirmed by the estate's private physician, Silas didn't storm in with demands of termination. He fell to his knees in the hallway, pressing his forehead against the cold floor while a sound like a wounded animal escaped his throat. He was trapped between the crushing trauma of his own past, a mother who had been erased for her mistakes, and the terrifying, radiant possibility of a future with Selim. For 6 days, Silas hovered like a ghost, bringing Selim bowls of ice chips and blankets, his scent a confused, agonized swirl of cedarwood and salt. He watched Selim's belly with a mixture of awe and absolute terror, his hand hovering inches away, never daring to touch as if he feared he would shatter the miracle he didn't deserve. However, the corporate world he had built on blood and ice began to bleed into their sanctuary. A hostile board of directors, sensing Silas's distraction, began a scorched earth campaign against Kingston Enterprises, threatening to liquidate the very assets that funded Selim's brother's care. Silas stood at the window of the study, looking at the distant city lights, his jaw clenched so tight it threatened to crack, realizing that to protect the life growing inside Selim, he might have to become the monster the world expected him to be one last time. The pressure of the board's uprising transformed Silas back into a weapon, but this time his edge was serrated with a desperate, paternal franticness that Selim found more terrifying than his coldness. While Silas spent his days in the city ruthlessly decapitating the careers of his rivals, he spent his nights at the estate in a state of hyperfixation, installing medical-grade air filtration systems and obsessively monitoring Selim's nutritional intake as if he could bribe the universe into a safe delivery. Selim watched this from the periphery of his own existence, his body a battlefield where hope fought a losing war against the memory of the first clinic visit. The fragility of their peace shattered when Silas, driven by a paranoid fear that Selim's brother's medical status was being used as leverage, moved the ailing boy into the estate without consulting Selim first. It was meant to be a gesture of ultimate protection, but to Selim, it felt like the final collection of his remaining collateral, a move that placed his entire world under Silas's singular thumb. The confrontation that night was silent but tectonic. Selim stood in the nursery Silas had already begun to furnish with hauntingly beautiful, hand-carved cribs, and he simply pointed at the monitors and then at himself, his hands signing with a violent, jagged speed. "You are not protecting us from the world. You are protecting your own guilt from the truth." Silas stopped in the doorway, the scent of cedarwood turning bitter and scorched, and for the first time he didn't try to close the distance or assert his dominance. He simply stood there, a billionaire who owned half the city but couldn't buy a single moment of genuine trust, watching as Selim turned away to cradle a stomach that felt more like a ticking clock than a promise of a new beginning. The pressure of the board's uprising transformed Silas back into a weapon, but this time his edge was serrated with a desperate, paternal franticness that Selim found more terrifying than his coldness. While Silas spent his days in the city ruthlessly decapitating the careers of his rivals, he spent his nights at the estate in a state of hyperfixation, installing medical-grade air filtration systems and obsessively monitoring Selim's nutritional intake as if he could bribe the universe into a safe delivery. Selim watched this from the periphery of his own existence, his body a battlefield where hope fought a losing war against the memory of the first clinic visit. The fragility of their peace shattered when Silas, driven by a paranoid fear that Selim's brother's medical status was being used as leverage, moved the ailing boy into the estate without consulting Selim first. It was meant to be a gesture of ultimate protection, but to Selim, it felt like the final collection of his remaining collateral, a move that placed his entire world under Silas's singular thumb. The confrontation that night was silent but tectonic. Selim stood in the nursery Silas had already begun to furnish with hauntingly beautiful, hand-carved cribs, and he simply pointed at the monitors and then at himself, his hands signing with a violent, jagged speed. "You are not protecting us from the world. You are protecting your own guilt from the truth." Silas stopped in the doorway, the scent of cedarwood turning bitter and scorched, and for the first time he didn't try to close the distance or assert his dominance. He simply stood there, a billionaire who owned half the city but couldn't buy a single moment of genuine trust, watching as Selim turned away to cradle a stomach that felt more like a ticking clock than a promise of a new beginning. The 8th month of the pregnancy brought a heatwave that seemed to bake the tension into the very walls of the cliffside estate, turning the glass house into a kiln of unspoken resentments. Silas had become a specter of his former self, his eyes permanently bloodshot as he balanced the weight of a crumbling board of directors with the terrifying physical fragility of Selim. The board, led by Silas's own cousin, finally struck at the one thing Silas couldn't calculate: the human heart. They leaked a falsified report to the press claiming that Selim was being held against his will, forcing a public inquiry that brought the police and the media to the gates of their sanctuary. In the chaos of the flashing lights and the sirens, the stress became a physical force. Selim collapsed in the garden, his body finally buckling under the weight of 2 years of psychological siege. Silas was there in an instant, but for the first time his alpha strength was useless against the internal hemorrhage that had begun. As the helicopter lifted off toward the city, Silas held Selim's limp hand, his scent of cedarwood replaced by the metallic copper stench of blood and the salt of his own silent tears. In the operating theater, the roles were cruelly reversed from the first time. Silas stood behind the glass, screaming at the doctors to save them, his roar echoing through the sterile halls of the hospital he owned but could not control. When the head surgeon finally emerged, his mask splattered with red, he didn't look at Silas the billionaire, but at Silas the broken man, and delivered the news that the child had been saved, but that the damage to Selim's body was a debt that nature might finally collect in full. The hospital room was a symphony of rhythmic beeps and the hiss of oxygen, a sterile cocoon where Silas Vane finally learned that silence wasn't a tool for control, but a void where his soul was being dismantled. Selim lay motionless, a pale shadow amidst the white linen, his breathing tethered to a machine while their newborn son, a fragile, golden-eyed miracle named Leo, thrived in a glass incubator 3 floors away. Silas didn't leave the bedside for 10 days. He sat in the same suit he had worn during the collapse, his billionaire's posture slumped, his hands folded in a posture of prayer he hadn't used since childhood. He watched the monitors with the same obsessive intensity he had once used to track stock fluctuations. But now, the only ledger that mattered was the steady, fragile wave of Selim's heartbeat. When the board members tried to reach him to discuss the plummeting share prices and the public relations disaster at the gates, Silas didn't even answer the phone. He threw it against the marble wall, watching it shatter just as his carefully constructed life had. He spent hours whispering to the unconscious Selim, confessions of a man who had confused possession with protection, and who had realized too late that he had been the true ghost in their relationship, a hollow shell of a man who had built a kingdom but lacked a home. On the 11th night, Selim's fingers twitched against Silas's palm, and as his eyes slowly opened, they didn't hold the fear Silas expected, but a profound, weary distance that felt like an ocean between them. Silas choked back a sob, pressing his forehead to Selim's cold hand, but Selim merely looked toward the door, his silent gaze asking the only question that mattered: "Where is my son?" The introduction of Leo into the hospital room was a moment of agonizingly beautiful friction, as Selim's maternal instincts flickered to life even as his body remained a broken map of Silas's past mistakes. Silas watched from the corner of the room, intentionally keeping his distance, his scent of cedarwood dialed back to a faint, apologetic whisper so as not to overwhelm the baby's sensitive nose. He saw the way Selim's hands, though still trembling and bruised from IV lines, cradled the infant with a protective ferocity that excluded Silas entirely, creating a private universe of 2 within the sterile ward. Silas had spent his life winning every negotiation, but as he watched Selim press his forehead to Leo's tiny, golden-furred head, he realized he was looking at a debt he could never repay with money or estates. To bridge the gap, Silas began a process of unmaking himself. He stepped down as CEO of Kingston Enterprises, handing the reins to a trust, and spent his days learning the practical, mundane details of childcare. How to warm a bottle to exactly 37 degrees C, how to change a diaper without waking a sleeping child, and how to sit in the darkness of 3:00 a.m. without demanding anything in return. However, Selim remained a fortress of silence. He accepted the help Silas offered with a clinical, hollow politeness, but he never looked Silas in the eye, and he never allowed the alpha to touch the claiming marks on his neck. The psychological ledger was still imbalanced, and as Selim's strength returned, Silas realized that the greatest test of his love wouldn't be his ability to hold Selim close, but his willingness to finally open the door and let him choose to walk away. The move from the hospital back to the estate was not a return to the gilded cage, but a transition into a house of ghosts where every hallway whispered of the first procedure and the long months of isolation. Silas had stripped the estate of its guards and its high-tech surveillance, replacing them with open windows and a staff that looked to Selim for direction rather than Silas. The alpha lived in the guest wing, a self-imposed exile that served as his daily penance. Selim thrived in his new role as Leo's father. his mathematical mind now dedicated to the complex rhythms of a growing infant. But his interactions with Silas remained as cold and precise as a winter frost. One evening, Silas found Selim in the nursery, the soft glow of the nightlight illuminating the exhausted, hollow circles under the Omega's eyes. Instead of stepping in to take the baby, Silas simply placed a travel folder on the changing table. It contained a deed to a small, private villa in a coastal town Selim had once mentioned in a dream, along with a bank account in Selim's name that would ensure his independence forever. "The car is ready whenever you want to go," Silas whispered, his voice thick with a grief he finally refused to hide. "I will not follow you, and I will not ask you to stay." Selim looked at the folder, then at the man who had spent 3 years trying to own him, and for the first time the Ice King looked small, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of a surrender that was absolute. Selim didn't pick up the folder. He looked at his son, then back at Silas, his amber eyes searching the Alpha's face for the predatory hunger that had once defined him, finding only a vast, empty landscape of regret that finally matched the void in Selim's own chest. The departure never happened. Selim kept the folder on the nightstand, a tangible reminder of a door that was now unlocked, but he spent the following weeks watching Silas navigate the house like a man walking through a minefield of his own making. The Ice King had become a servant to the mundane, spending hours in the kitchen perfecting the specific tea Selim liked or quietly repairing the ancient garden trellis that had rotted during the years of neglect. One night, a fierce coastal storm rattled the glass walls of the estate, the thunder echoing the violence of the night Leo was born, and Silas found Selim in the nursery, clutching the baby while his sense spiked with a sharp, metallic fear, a remnant of the trauma that no amount of luxury could erase. Silas didn't cross the threshold. He sat on the floor in the hallway, his back against the wall, and began to speak in a low, steady, rhythmic tone about his own mother, detailing for the first time the specific, agonizing moments of his childhood where love had been replaced by a ledger of expectations. He offered his past up like a sacrifice, not to excuse his actions, but to explain the broken machinery of his heart. Selim listened in the darkness, the baby finally falling asleep, and realized that for the first time, Silas wasn't using words to manipulate or control, but to bleed. After an hour of silence, Selim walked to the door and sat on the floor opposite Silas, the two of them separated only by the wooden frame of the doorway. He reached out and placed his hand on the floor between them, his fingers inching towards Silas's trembling hand. He didn't touch him yet, but he whispered the first words of a new equation. "The past is a fixed variable, Silas, but the future is still a probability we haven't solved." The 13th month of Leo's life coincided with a total atmospheric shift in the estate, as the Ice King and the mathematical ghost began the painstaking work of building a life from the wreckage of a dynasty. Silas had completely dismantled his corporate identity, transforming the Kingston brand into a foundation for Omega advocacy and reproductive rights, effectively spending his billions to ensure no other person would ever be subjected to the clinical violence Selim had endured. In the privacy of their home, the power dynamic had reached a strange, beautiful equilibrium. Selim was no longer the quiet assistant but the undisputed sovereign of their shared world, his silence replaced by a voice that was calm, authoritative, and occasionally laced with a sharp, dry wit that Silas adored. The physical distance between them finally collapsed one evening by the fireplace, not through a burst of predatory heat, but through a slow, deliberate choice. Selim reached out and traced the jagged line of Silas's jaw, his fingers no longer trembling with fear, but moving with the curiosity of a man discovering a new land. For the first time, Silas didn't take. He waited, his breath hitching as Selim leaned in to press a soft, lingering kiss against the claiming mark on Silas's own neck, a symbolic reversal that acknowledged Silas's total submission to their new reality. They spent the night talking not of ledgers or contracts, but of Leo's first steps and the garden that was finally blooming in vibrant, defiant colors. Selim realized that while the scars of the 3 lost futures would never fully vanish, they had become the foundation of a deeper, more resilient strength. He looked at Silas, the man who had been his captor, then his penance, and finally his partner, and saw not a monster, but a man who had finally learned that the most complex and rewarding equation in the universe wasn't one that could be solved, but one that had to be lived. The final chapter of their story was not written in the cold ink of a contract, but in the vibrant, chaotic reality of a life lived without the shadow of a cage. 3 years after the storm, the cliffside estate had been transformed from a sterile fortress into a home filled with the sounds of Leo's laughter and the scent of blooming jasmine. Silas had become a man whose strength was now measured by his patience. His once fearsome alpha presence mellowed into a steady, grounding warmth that acted as the anchor for Selim's brilliant, restless mind. Selim, now a renowned consultant in ethical economics, had reclaimed his voice and his body, moving through the world with a sovereign grace that commanded respect without ever needing to shout. On the anniversary of the day Silas had offered him the folder of freedom, they stood together on the balcony overlooking the sea, watching a 4-year-old Leo chase a golden retriever through the tall grass. Silas reached out, his hand finally resting on the curve of Selim's neck, his fingers tracing the soft skin with a reverence that spoke of 1,000 apologies. Selim leaned back into the touch, no longer a ghost in a suit, but a man who had successfully calculated the most difficult proof of all. That love, when stripped of ownership and fear, is an infinite sum that grows the more you give it away. They didn't speak of the Ice King or the calculus of despair anymore. Those were variables in an old equation that had long since been solved and discarded. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a bruised purple and gold that matched the resilience of their bond, Silas whispered a promise into the evening air, not of protection but of partnership. Selim smiled, his amber eyes bright with the light of 100 futures, realizing that his life hadn't been a tragedy after all, but a painstakingly beautiful redemption. They were no longer defined by what they had lost, but by the quiet, unbreakable peace of what they had chosen to keep.